The dog in Kennel 47 didn't beg for attention like the others. He didn't bark. He didn't even move. He just vanished into the shadows. The Riverside County Animal Shelter was overwhelmed, a place where the quiet desperation of abandoned pets echoed off the concrete walls. The staff worked tirelessly, but no matter how much they tried, the endless stream of unwanted animals continued to fill the cages. Every day was a battle, every empty kennel a victory, and every full one a reminder of the sadness that weighed heavily on their hearts. Yet among the sea of lost and neglected animals, one dog stood out like a shadow in the night. Shadow, a German shepherd, was unlike any other dog at the shelter. His fur was thin, matted, and dull, clinging to his bones like a layer of sorrow. His ribs jutted out sharply, and his eyes, once a bright, trusting amber, were now hollow with fear and uncertainty. His body trembled constantly, as if the weight of the world was bearing down on him. He didn't bark or whimper like the others. He didn't beg for attention or wag his tail. He simply sat in his kennel, motionless, staring into the distance like a ghost. The staff had named him Shadow because that's all he seemed to be anymore. A lingering presence, a trace of a life he once knew. His collar, once bright and new, had grown into his neck from neglect, a painful reminder of his past. Every time a human got too close, he flinched, retreating deeper into the shadows of his kennel, as if trying to disappear entirely. He was lost, not just to the world, but to himself. Director Marlene walked past his kennel, shaking her head as she glanced at his sad form. She sighed heavily, holding a stack of papers in her hands. She could feel the weight of those papers, each one a death sentence for another animal. It was a decision no one wanted to make, but it was sometimes necessary when there was no room, no resources, no hope left to offer. "We can't save them all," she muttered softly to herself, her eyes flicking to the euthanasia list. It was a cold reality, one she had to face every day, but for her today felt heavier. Shadow's gaze, even from behind the bars of his kennel, had haunted her. She wished there was more she could do, but Kelsey Martinez, the shelter's behavioral specialist, refused to accept that. Kelsey wasn't like the others. She saw past the outward appearance, beyond the terror and the scars. She saw the potential in every animal, and she believed, no matter how impossible it seemed, that every one of them deserved a chance. Kelsey had been keeping an eye on Shadow for weeks. She saw the way he flinched when someone walked past, the way his eyes darted around in a panic at every noise. His fear was palpable, suffocating him from the inside out. But there was also something else, something small but undeniable, a flicker of curiosity, a glimmer of recognition in his eyes when people passed by. She knew that there was more to him, that this shell of a dog hadn't given up entirely. Today, Kelsey decided, was the day she would reach him. She slid down onto the floor outside Shadow's kennel, her back against the cool concrete wall. The others were busy, occupied with their own tasks, so she had the time. She pulled out a book from her bag, something simple, something she could read aloud. She didn't focus on Shadow, not at first. She simply opened the book and began to read, her voice soft and steady. At first, nothing happened. Shadow remained where he was, his eyes distant and unseeing. But Kelsey didn't stop. She kept reading, letting her words fill the silence, her voice steady and calming. She ignored the fact that he wouldn't look at her. She didn't expect him to, not yet. And then, after what felt like an eternity, something shifted. Kelsey heard the faintest rustle of movement. At first, it was just the slightest sound, an almost imperceptible shift in the air. She kept reading, as though nothing had happened. And then slowly, she heard it again, a soft scrape of claws on the concrete floor. She looked up. Shadow's amber eyes were no longer staring off into the distance. For the first time in weeks, he was looking directly at her. Not with the terror she had expected, but with a strange mixture of curiosity and wariness. He didn't move closer. He didn't approach her, but he had finally acknowledged her presence. Kelsey's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, but it was everything. This was a breakthrough. This was the first time he had looked at anyone with something other than fear in his eyes. It was the first sign that he was willing to let someone in, that maybe, just maybe, he still had a chance. "Ma'am," Kelsey whispered to Director Marlene, who had been watching from the doorway. Her voice was barely audible, but the awe was clear in her tone.
Shadow hadn't just
"I
noticed
think you
Kelsey.
just did the impossible." He had looked back, really looked at her, for the first time, And for the first time, Kelsey saw the spark of hope, a spark she knew she could nurture, if given the chance. For the first time, the dog who had disappeared into the shadows was stepping back into the light. Claire Winslow wasn't looking for a dog. In fact, she wasn't looking for anything at all. She had come to Riverside County Animal Shelter that day to drop off a box of old towels, nothing more. Her life, still adjusting to the quiet aftermath of a divorce, was one of routine and solitude. She had learned to fill the empty spaces in her home with work, with tasks, with distractions. Her mind often wandered back to the years of her marriage, but she didn't let herself dwell there for long. It was easier to keep moving. As she made her way down the sterile hallway of the shelter, Claire's eyes flitted across the rows of cages, each one containing a different soul, each one with a story that could break your heart if you looked too closely. The barking and whining of the dogs were a constant hum in the background, a reminder of the noise of life she'd been trying to outrun. She paused for a moment to scratch the ears of a playful terrier in a kennel, offering a soft smile as it wagged its tail excitedly. But her gaze drifted further down the hall, to the farthest cage, where a shadow seemed to loom, still and silent. That's when she saw him. The German Shepherd was unlike any dog she had ever seen. He wasn't barking for attention, or wagging his tail in hopes of being noticed. He wasn't jumping up at the bars as so many others did. No, this dog, this shadow, was sitting in the corner of his kennel, his eyes fixed on the floor, his body thin and almost skeletal. His fur looked matted, as though it hadn't seen a brush in ages. The collar around his neck was tight, having grown into his skin, and his eyes, those haunting amber eyes, seemed to carry the weight of the world in them. There was something in his gaze that made Claire stop in her tracks. A sense of quiet sorrow radiated from him, and without thinking, Claire's chest tightened. It wasn't the physical pain that had drawn her here. It was something deeper. She had a way of noticing things in people, and even in animals, that others couldn't always see. And what she saw in the German Shepherd wasn't just fear. It was the kind of despair that only comes from being lost for far too long. For a moment she stood there, her hand still gripping the box of towels. She hadn't planned on staying, but something about this dog felt different. His stillness was almost magnetic. Claire exhaled slowly, setting the box down on the floor beside her, her fingers brushing against the cool concrete. Without consciously deciding, she sank to the floor outside his kennel. Her legs crossed beneath her, and she folded her arms loosely in her lap. It was an odd impulse, a strange instinct. Maybe it was because she felt a kinship with this dog, this shadow of a creature who seemed to carry the weight of an invisible burden. She didn't know why she did it, but she stayed there, quiet and still, just sitting across from him. The minutes ticked by. Her presence didn't seem to faze him at first. His gaze never left the ground, his body unmoving. Claire was used to the idea of animals being afraid, especially the ones who had been through hardship. She knew that animals, like people, needed time to heal. And maybe, just maybe, if she stayed still long enough, this dog might sense that she wasn't like the others. She wasn't here to impose or rush him. She was just present. She began to hum softly, a tune she often sang when she was alone in her apartment. It wasn't a song that carried any particular significance, just something familiar and comforting. The sound was gentle, floating through the air like a whisper. She hummed, letting the melody fill the silence between them. She wasn't trying to engage him, not really. She just wanted him to know she was there. And so she sat and hummed. 3 hours passed, and still, there was no movement from the dog. Claire's legs were starting to cramp, but she didn't mind. She had always been one for patience, even in moments when she felt like giving up. But as the minutes stretched on, she couldn't deny the weariness that began to settle in her bones. She wondered if she should leave, if maybe she was just another face in the crowd to this dog, another human who would walk away without ever truly seeing him. But then, as if on cue, something shifted in the stillness. Claire's eyes flicked upward, her gaze never leaving the dog. There was the faintest sound, a soft scrape of claws against the cold concrete floor. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. A breath of warm air brushed against the bars of the kennel. And for the first time in hours, he didn't leap forward or bark. Instead, he inched closer, just enough to see her face. He stopped a few feet away, his body still trembling slightly, but his amber eyes, those haunted eyes, were now locked on hers. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The connection between them, however fragile, was palpable. There was no fear in his gaze now, just cautious curiosity. A fragile trust, perhaps. She couldn't say for sure. But she knew in that moment that something had changed. Something had clicked between them. Kelsey, the shelter's behavioral specialist, who had been quietly observing from a distance, moved forward slowly. Her voice, soft but full of wonder, broke the silence. "Ma'am," Kelsey whispered, almost breathless, "I think you just did the impossible." Claire smiled softly, her heart swelling in her chest. She didn't feel like she had done anything monumental. She had just sat there, existing alongside a creature who, for reasons beyond her understanding, had decided to look back. And in that simple act, Claire knew that something had begun. A beginning she wasn't looking for, but one she would gladly embrace. For Shadow, this was the first time in a long while that someone had chosen to sit with him, to meet him in his silence. And perhaps for both of them, this was the beginning of healing. Ryan Jordan hadn't spoken in days. His wheelchair, a constant companion since the explosion that had shattered his body, seemed more like a prison than a seat of comfort. The veteran, once a proud soldier, now sat silently in the rehabilitation center, staring out the window at the world that seemed to have forgotten him. His body was broken, his spirit even more so. The traumatic brain injury from the blast had left him unable to do most things on his own, but it was the emotional scars that hurt the most. The guilt, the loneliness, the nightmares. For weeks, Claire had worked with Ryan, trying to coax him into engaging, trying to pull him from the abyss that seemed to swallow him whole. But he was distant, a shadow of the man he had once been. There were days when he barely acknowledged her presence, when he would shut his eyes and pretend the world didn't exist. On other days, he would mutter words, fragments of a conversation, before sinking back into his own mind, lost to whatever memories haunted him. It wasn't that Ryan didn't want to heal. Claire could see that he was trying, but the effort often seemed futile. He couldn't let go of the past, the faces of the soldiers who hadn't made it out of Afghanistan, the screams, the blood. They were all there, just beneath the surface. And Shadow, Ryan's K9 partner from the war, was the one thing that still held a place in his fractured heart. It was during one of their quiet sessions when Claire mentioned the shelter's German Shepherd, the one she had seen that morning. She had no idea it would stir something in Ryan, let alone trigger a response. As she spoke about the dog's scarred shoulder and the way he had reacted to commands, she saw his fists clench, his entire body going rigid. "What's his name?" Ryan rasped, his voice rough from days of silence. "Shadow," Claire replied, not sure what to expect. The name seemed to hang in the air for a moment, thick with unspoken history. Ryan's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a tight line. His fingers gripped the armrests of his wheelchair as if he were trying to ground himself in reality. "Say that again," Ryan commanded, his voice low and tense. "Shadow," Claire repeated, a little taken aback by the sudden intensity in his tone. Ryan's gaze locked onto her with a sharpness that sent a shiver down Claire's spine. There was something in his eyes, something wild, something desperate, that made her pause. She wasn't sure if she should push further, but before she could say anything else, Ryan's voice cracked. "My K9 partner. They told me he died in Afghanistan." Claire's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know how to respond. The weight of his words hung in the room, thick and suffocating. The dog, Shadow, wasn't just a dog to Ryan. He was more than that. He was a part of him, a companion, a friend, a lifeline. And to hear that Shadow had been presumed dead, it was a wound that Ryan had never fully healed from. Claire's mind raced as she tried to process what he had said. Shadow had been Ryan's partner in war, someone who had fought beside him, someone who had kept him grounded when everything around them had been chaos. And now Shadow was alive. He was here, in Riverside, waiting for something, waiting for someone. I'm going to make a call," Claire said, her voice shaky but determined.
Ryan's eyes were already
"I'll
focused on
find
the
out if
door.
it's really him." His fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrests as if he were counting the seconds. His mind was already racing, already reliving the bond he had shared with his K9 partner. Shadow had been there through it all, the dangers, the fear, the adrenaline. Shadow had been his constant, his rock, and now the possibility of seeing him again, of finding him, it was almost too much to hope for. Claire reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number for Riverside County Animal Shelter. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let this slip away. If there was even a chance that Ryan's shadow was still alive, she had to know. They both had to know. The call felt like it lasted an eternity, each second stretched thin with anticipation. Claire spoke with the shelter director, confirming the details of the dog, his microchip, the scar on his shoulder, the history that matched what Ryan had said. As the director spoke, Claire's heart raced. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't some stray dog looking for a home. This was Shadow. When Claire hung up the phone, she turned to Ryan, who was staring at her intently, waiting for an answer. His eyes were wide, his breath shallow. She didn't have to say anything. He already knew. "It's him," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. "It's really him." Ryan's face contorted with emotion. His breath hitched, and for the first time in days, his eyes filled with tears. Shadow was alive. His partner, his best friend, his hero, alive. The room fell silent, save for the sound of Ryan's shaky breathing and the soft rustle of fabric as he wiped away his tears. Claire could feel the weight of the moment settling over them both. This wasn't just a reunion. It was the healing of two broken souls. Ryan had been lost for so long, but now there was a chance. There was hope. There was Shadow. And nothing could take that away. The air in the meet and greet room at the Riverside County Animal Shelter was thick with anticipation. Claire wheeled Ryan into the room, her hand trembling slightly on the handle of his chair. The moment they stepped through the door, time seemed to slow. Shadow was there, standing at the far end of the room, his dark amber eyes locked on Ryan as though he had known, all this time, that his soldier was coming. The dog's posture was alert, his muscular frame tense, as if holding back the floodgates of emotions. His coat was a bit more ragged than Ryan remembered, faded, worn from the years. But those eyes, those familiar eyes, were unmistakable. They had been his anchor in the darkest days of war, and now they were all Ryan could see. Claire wheeled Ryan closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the tension in the room, could almost taste the raw emotion in the air. Ryan's body was rigid, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, as though he were holding on to the last thread of his sanity. His gaze never left Shadow, his breath quickening, his pulse racing. Shadow's tail flicked, and he took a tentative step forward. And then, as if the dam had broken, the dog surged forward, moving with a speed and grace that belied his age. In a blur of black and tan fur, Shadow launched himself into Ryan's lap, knocking the wheelchair backward with a force that sent both dog and soldier tumbling to the floor. A gasp of shock filled the room as Shadow licked Ryan's face, whining like a puppy, his tail wagging furiously. Ryan's hands were on Shadow's fur, gripping tightly, pulling him close, as though afraid that if he let go, the dog might vanish again. Tears streamed down Ryan's face, and he whispered into Shadow's fur, his voice broken and full of disbelief. "It's him. God, it's really him," Ryan sobbed, his body shaking with emotion. The room erupted into chaos, tears, cheers, and the sound of cameras snapping photos. Claire stepped back, allowing Ryan and Shadow their moment, her heart swelling as she watched the reunion unfold. She had seen the pain in Ryan's eyes for so long, the sadness, the loss. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw something else. Hope, joy, a spark of life. Claire glanced at the shelter staff, many of whom were now wiping tears from their eyes. Everyone knew how special this moment was. How many soldiers had come home from war with pieces of their hearts and souls broken, only to find that the dog who had kept them going was gone. And yet, here they were. Shadow was back. And for Ryan, that was everything. Claire's mind raced as she thought about how this moment would change their lives. The video of the reunion, captured by a staff member's phone, would go viral within minutes. It was the kind of story that the world couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about a dog reuniting with a soldier. It was about love, resilience, and the bonds that could Ryan with affection. Licking his face, Ryan pulled back just enough to look into the dog's eyes. His hands trembled as he cupped Shadow's face, as if he were trying to memorize every detail. The scar on his shoulder, the way his fur still had that familiar sheen, the sound of his breathing. Shadow was here. Shadow was real. He wasn't a ghost anymore. Ryan leaned in, pressing his forehead to Shadow's, and for a long moment, the two of them just stayed there, lost in the comfort of one another. Time seemed to stretch, and in that stretch there was only the sound of Ryan's quiet sobs, the warmth of Shadow's body against his, and the unspoken understanding between them. Claire watched from a distance, knowing that this moment, this reunion, was something that no one could ever take away from them. She could already hear the buzz outside the room, the calls that would soon come, the questions about how Shadow, a military working dog, had ended up in a shelter in California, abandoned, waiting for a new home. The mystery of how Shadow had survived, how he had ended up here, was still a puzzle that would need to be pieced together. But for now, that didn't matter. For now, all that mattered was the bond between a soldier and his dog. And that bond, as Ryan whispered between his tears, would never be broken again. "Thank you," Ryan whispered, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for bringing him back to me." Claire smiled softly, her heart full. She didn't need to say anything. She had already given them both what they needed, a family, reunited, and the world would soon know about it. The days that followed Shadow's reunion with Ryan were nothing short of miraculous. Shadow, once a ghost of a dog, now stood firm by Ryan's side, his presence a constant, unwavering support. The veteran, who had once been consumed by the shadows of his past, found himself drawn into the warmth of the present, of the bond he had thought lost forever. Shadow refused to leave Ryan's side, as though every fiber of his being recognized the person who had once been his world. During physical therapy sessions, Shadow would nudge Ryan's legs with his nose, as if trying to encourage him to stand taller, walk further. He had been trained to protect, to serve, but it seemed now he had a new mission, to help heal the man he had left behind in the chaos of war. Ryan, in turn, found himself pushing harder than ever before. Each day, his steps grew steadier, his movements more confident. He could feel Shadow's eyes on him, a silent promise of companionship and loyalty that gave him the strength to keep going, even when his body screamed in protest. Every step forward was a victory, no matter how small. Claire watched it all unfold with a quiet pride, lingering after therapy sessions to offer encouragement, to provide the meals she had begun to bring from home, and to watch as the bond between the two grew stronger. It wasn't just Shadow helping Ryan, it was Ryan helping Shadow too. There was a quiet understanding between them, something deeper than words, something that only those who had fought alongside each other in the trenches of war could truly understand. The laughter that echoed through the room as Shadow playfully tried to steal Ryan's socks or nudge him into doing more exercises was infectious. Claire would often find herself laughing along, her heart swelling with a warmth she hadn't realized she had been missing. She had started this journey with a simple desire to help, to make a difference in the lives of those who came through her clinic. But now with Ryan and Shadow, she had discovered something far more profound, what it meant to heal, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow through the window, Ryan and Claire found themselves sitting together in the quiet of the therapy room. Shadow lay at their feet, his head resting contentedly on Ryan's lap. The room was calm, peaceful, something that had once felt so distant to Ryan, who had been lost in the trauma of war for so long. "I never thought I'd be able to walk again," Ryan said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper as he stroked Shadow's fur. "Not like this, not without the pain, but with him here. It's like the weight's been lifted." Claire smiled, her heart full as she watched the bond between them grow. "It's amazing what love and loyalty can do for someone," she said. "It's like a wound healing from the inside out. Sometimes it's not just about physical recovery. It's about healing what's broken within." Ryan looked at her then, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You've helped more than you'll ever know," he said quietly. "You brought us together." Her smile was soft. "I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad I could be a part of this. But don't forget, you did the hardest part. You opened your heart again. And that's the first step toward healing." Ryan nodded, his gaze returning to Shadow. "I couldn't have done it without him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's more than a dog to me. He's my brother, my battle buddy. He's been through it all with me." As the days went on, Claire continued to visit, bringing her meals and her encouragement, watching as Ryan and Shadow's bond deepened with each passing moment. And the healing didn't stop there. Shadow's presence became more than just a comfort for Ryan. It was a reminder to everyone around him that recovery wasn't just about time. It was about love, patience, and the willingness to face the future, no matter how uncertain it may seem. And in that healing, something remarkable happened. Ryan began to heal in ways he hadn't thought possible. He found himself looking forward to each day, no longer burdened by the weight of his past. The laughter and lightness that Shadow brought into his life seeped into every corner of his existence, and for the first time in years, Ryan felt alive again. One evening, as they sat together, Ryan, Claire, and Shadow, Ryan looked out the window at the fading light. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, and in that moment, he realized that, for the first time in a long time, he was at peace too. "I think we're going to be okay," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. Claire looked at him, her heart full, and nodded. "I think you're right." And Shadow, ever loyal, thumped his tail in agreement, his head resting gently on Ryan's lap, as if to say that he would always be there, by his side, ready to face whatever came next together. The journey wasn't over. There would still be struggles, still be moments of doubt. But with Shadow by his side, Ryan knew one thing for certain. He was no longer walking alone. A year had passed since the fateful reunion that had captured the hearts of so many. A year since Shadow, the war dog thought lost forever, had been reunited with his former partner Ryan. But the journey didn't end there. In many ways, it had only just begun. Ryan stood tall, stronger than he had ever been before, his once broken body now capable of walking without the aid of a wheelchair. Shadow, always at his side, was a constant reminder of the battles they had fought. Together, both on the field of war and in the quiet struggles of recovery. There was an undeniable bond between them, one that could never be broken, not by time or distance or the pain of the past. Claire had become a permanent fixture in their lives. She had been there through it all, the physical therapy, the long nights of uncertainty, the hard-earned victories. And now she had taken on a new role in Ryan's life, not just as his therapist, but as someone he could trust, someone who had become his friend. Their bond had grown unspoken but understood, a quiet, unbreakable connection built on respect, compassion, and shared experiences. One cool autumn evening, the three of them stood in front of a small, intimate crowd at Riverside County Animal Shelter's annual fundraiser. Ryan, looking every bit the man who had reclaimed his life, stood proudly with his back straight and a smile on his face. He had come a long way from the broken, despondent veteran who had once locked himself away from the world. Today, he was an inspiration, proof that healing was possible, no matter how lost someone might feel. Claire stood beside him, her hand in his, a proud smile on her face. She had come to the shelter that day with nothing but a desire to help. Now she was the new director of the VA's K-9 therapy program, her life forever entwined with Ryan and Shadow's. The program she had helped create had already begun making a difference for countless other veterans, and she couldn't have been prouder. And there at their feet stood Shadow, healed, proud, and standing tall beside his two best friends. The dog who had once been a shadow of his former self now held his head high, the same fierce loyalty in his amber eyes, his body strong and healthy once again. It was at that moment that the shelter's director, Marlene, called Ryan and Shadow to the stage. With tears in her eyes, she handed Shadow a special medal, a medal of exceptional service and resilience. Shadow's ears perked up, and he stepped forward, tail wagging gently. The crowd cheered, and Ryan's eyes glistened with emotion as he looked at his dog, his brother. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Ryan took the microphone, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This dog saved my life. He never gave up on me, even when I didn't believe in myself. Shadow is more than just a dog. He's my family, and together, we've overcome more than anyone thought possible." But Ryan's gaze never left Shadow, who stood beside him, his head held high. Shadow had been the one constant through the darkest moments of Ryan's life, and he would continue to be the light that guided him forward. Claire squeezed Ryan's hand, and they shared a quiet moment, standing together as an unexpected family. They had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and now, as they looked toward the future, they knew that their bond was unbreakable. Some bonds, Ryan thought, even war can't break. As they left the stage, the trio walked out into the night, Shadow trotting proudly at their side, his tail held high. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Because in the end, they were no longer just a therapist, a veteran, and a dog. They were family. and nothing would ever break them apart. The end.